Okay. Hello, everybody out there. My name is Jeff Brison. This past year, I had the privilege of living at Massey College as a senior resident, really basking in the rich intellectual community provided by a group of brilliant emerging scholars in graduate studies ranging from chemical engineering to art history, and including everything in between. In real life, that is on sabbatical life, I teach history, and I'm co-director of the Cultural Studies graduate program at Queen's University. I welcome you to this afternoon's edition of Massey Dialogues, an online salon discussion series that began in April and features experts and scholars from the Massey community and beyond, discussing pressing issues of the day. I wish to acknowledge the land on which Massey College and the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. We're grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. I wish to note as well that today I'm speaking to you from Queen's University, which sits on the traditional lands of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples. I think it's important to acknowledge the land in this particular moment and in these particular places, because as a settler and as a member of the academic community, of which many of you are also a part, provides me an opportunity to reassert my commitment to the struggle against the systems of oppression that have dispossessed Indigenous people of their lands and denied their rights to self-determination, and to reassert my commitment to building an environment of respect and reconciliation, and to addressing the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action in ways that move beyond words to concrete action. My fellow panelists today are founding members of the North American Cultural Diplomacy Initiative, an informal network of scholars and practitioners from across the cultural field, international relations, and policy fields who share an interest in reframing current debates around culture and diplomacy in the study and practice of global relations. Joining me on the panel today are César Villanueva Rivas, a professor of international relations and director of the Department of International Studies at the Universidad Americana in Mexico City. Lynda Jessup, a Massey College senior resident this past year and associate dean, graduate studies and global engagement in the Faculty of Arts and Science at Queen's University, and the director of the North American Cultural Diplomacy Initiative. And finally, Sascha Priewe, a Massey College senior fellow and the Royal Ontario Museum's associate vice president, strategic initiatives and partnerships. Sascha is also cross-appointed to art history and museum studies at the University of Toronto and is affiliated with the Cultural Studies program at Queen's University. Tonight, we'll be discussing cultural diplomacy in the light of the present COVID moment. We ask whether COVID-19 is changing the face of cultural diplomacy, or is the current prohibition on face-to-face encounters in a don't touch your face environment simply making it apparent that an old school exclusivity of traditional diplomatic practice is already in the rearview mirror, as much a victim of the now decades-old global era rise of information communication technologies, as it is in changes in the post-Cold War international environment, and as it is in this environment. I mean, obviously right now in the COVID moment, diplomacy as we know it has changed radically. But I think the members of this panel suggest that many of those changes are being highlighted in the present environment, but really precede it. I'd like to make a note to the audience, to everyone tuning in online. Thank you, first of all, for joining us. I encourage you to ask questions to our guests throughout today's dialogue. We'd like this discussion to be as interactive as possible, and you can participate by posting your questions from inside the YouTube live stream where we are now. Type your questions in the chat panel that you see on the right of your screen, and we'll do our best to respond to you. Okay, so I'd like to begin with questions to the panel. For practitioners of state diplomacy, of traditional state diplomacy, practicing diplomacy is challenging in the currently social distance environment because they are so dependent on in-person exchange and dialogue. We think, for instance, of diplomacy as a matter of flying around the world, working in embassies, meeting people person to person, shaking hands, having hallway conversations, closed doors meetings amongst practitioners. But in the present global era, and particularly at this precise moment, we've seen the emergence of a more networked approach to diplomacy and of an environment that includes a broader range of non-state actors who can more easily pivot to the digital environment on online formats and exploit different avenues for connection and communications than those practiced traditionally by formal diplomats. Sascha, do you want to respond to that?
Sure. Thank you, Jeff, and good evening, everybody. Such a pleasure to be joining this conversation tonight, especially as a senior fellow of Massey College. It's so wonderful to be part of this vibrant community and to be engaging in these really stimulating conversations. And well, most of you will also have undergone this shift, if you had the privilege to do so, to a live on Zoom or Teams or whatever your platform is of the day or of the hour, and be utterly exhausted at the end of the day because of it. And of course, this is not left traditional state-based diplomacy unaffected, where instead of the meetings, as Jeff mentioned, that appear in persons, whether with handshakes or with elbow bumps, have now shifted to online media. Now, while the table of those conversations has changed, my question would be whether those around the table are still the same people as before. And this particular pertinent questions in this time of global crisis, when we're facing global challenge of a pandemic alongside several other challenges that might actually demand global solutions. And to that effect, traditional state-based diplomacy might not be the entire answer as we move from the club of the nation states to a network type of diplomacy. The diplomatic landscape has already broadened over many years to include a vast variety of actors, including the nation states. And these actors include everybody from cities and subnational governments to NGOs, cultural institutions, artists, celebrities, and of course, indigenous communities who have long been independently active diplomatically on the global stage. So now, as the pivot happens in traditional state-based diplomacy to online formats, that may be somewhat more easier to convene and arrange than flying to a place and meeting in person and so on, has the range of the participants in these conversations changed as well to account for the full range of global actors and voices? Or have we simply shifted from a conversation analog in place to making it somewhat happening in an online media without actually broadening the voices that should be included?
Thanks. Cesar, do you have thoughts on this or on what Sascha was saying? Or yeah.
Yes. First, I would like to say hello to all the audience, to the people who took the time to come and watch us. I also want to say hi to you, Jeff, to Lynda, and to Sascha. I'm really pleased to share this space with you in a networked academic, strengthening our relationships with the NACD group. It's really a pleasure to be with all of you here. First thing I want to say is that the discussion about non-state actors has been around for many years now, not only in global studies per se, but also in international relations, diplomacy, and perhaps more decisively in migration and world economy. Since at least the fall of the Berlin Wall, We have seen a multiplication of factors that play in the international and or the global arena without prejudice, without passports, and perhaps without regret also. Depending how you understand freedom and responsibility, this can take different angles. If you are a pure liberal, say, somebody who advocates the individual freedoms as the baseline, you will be perhaps happy with non-state actors as the bottom line. This approach creates more capacity, more capacity for all actors, be that individuals, firms, NGOs, civil society, to interact in a seemingly borderless world and with many less legal restrictions to move, exchange, and or communicate. Having said this, this also gives opportunities for other groups, let's say for the bad guys, another type of negative non-state actors that promote crime, violence, and destruction. But that's not what we want to talk about here. The networked approach to positive non-state actors is essential, but in my opinion requires a lot of filtering to put it into action in favor of the best societal causes. Now, if your vision is for social responsibility associated with freedoms, you still want to have the empowerment of non-state actors, but with regulation and restrictions, I would say, in order to secure society from potential threats. For that, you require strong state capacities in place in order to keep control and surveillance of those networks, and also in order to know what happens inside them and prevent conflicts and violence. I'm not advocating a non-democratic control or surveillance. Actually, what I say here is my point of departure is democracy. Diplomacy, in the traditional sense, is control or surveillance in order to prevent conflict and wars between the states. Diplomacy, in the most rational form, in its more modern form, is a state-driven activity that pretends to keep track of all international relations in order to keep a relative power advantage in a context of conflict and power struggle. And let me come to a small conclusion here, just to give ideas for the debate. Now, non-state actors have gained a presence in diplomacy through showing the inefficiency of only state actor approach into global operations. Non-state actors have left a mark in at least 3 areas of diplomacy and international relations. The first one would be legitimacy and ethics. The second one would be complementarity of state actions to make them more efficient. And the third contribution of the non-state actor approach to diplomacy could be in the incorporation of progressive agendas into diplomacy, things that traditional diplomats didn't think about because they were not part of the rational calculations. So I think there is quite a good range of possibilities to debate society in the global diplomacy in a global fora with non-state actors included.
Lynda, do you have anything to follow up on that? I have a follow-up question, but I just wanted to make sure that you, if you have anything on your mind here.
Well, yeah, I was just thinking about, well, actually, no, go ahead, and I'll jump in as we get going. I don't want to take up too much time.
Yeah, no, I was thinking as César talked about, and as generally we were pushing in the direction of new actors and non-state actors. And you talked about, César, the bad guys and the people that are maybe, I'll just leave it at that. But I'm thinking of a particularly a particularly interesting and I think important group of new non-state actor who I think most people would put on the sort of good side of the equation, probably in the people in this room and in much of the audience, and people, actors that we would traditionally have thought as being involved in the diplomatic sphere. And I'm thinking of people that are protesting on the streets right now. And they're dealing with what might seem like domestic issues, protesting racial violence in the United States and in Canada and elsewhere. But they're bringing these things to an international forum in a way that I think really broadens the range of diplomacy nowadays. And it's because of this. They're part of broader civil society networks than a traditional diplomacy would allow for, and really makes what might seem like domestic issues. It expands serious cultural issues that, in some ways, the world shares, and it brings those out into that broader fora, I suppose. I'm not. I think maybe I answered a question there, but I wondered if people. We've been trying to think about how these things fit together, and I think that is an important group of non-state actors.
Yeah.
This maybe my own comment maybe segues into my next question. It's been pointed out that COVID is not merely a biological pandemic; it's a biopolitical pandemic. COVID is creating, or more precisely, making apparent social hierarchies and imbalances of power, of class, race, age, ability, gender, and nationality, for instance. In short, the pandemic itself is playing out differently on different populations. How does a cultural relations approach to diplomacy function in this environment, and what can it contribute to alleviating or addressing the crisis in I think, a better way? Yeah.
Can I jump in there?
Yeah.
I was going to say, just what you've just said is really interesting, because people are protesting in the midst of the risks around COVID-19. And so it does really show the degree to which people, as civil society, can work both nationally, locally, and globally within the context of COVID. So you have those kind of actions going on. I was going to say that what you say about it being a biopolitical pandemic is really interesting, because we say COVID diplomacy and we talk about right away, social distancing. It's a physical thing. We can't get too close, or we have to stay away from one another. We have to be careful. But as a biopolitical epidemic, as not something, just a virus that everyone can catch equally, it plays itself out through cultural and political variables. And we've seen that now, how COVID is a symptom of other issues. It's a symptom of systemic problems, systemic racism, misogyny, vulnerable populations. We call vulnerable populations because perhaps we make them vulnerable by the way in which we function. So coloniality is still at play and is really being felt. And all of these things in the context of COVID-19 are becoming so incredibly glaringly apparent to people. It's raising the profile of this, and I think what it does is, from our perspective, is really does underscore the value of a cultural relations approach to diplomacy, of when we're looking at mobilizing culture, we're not looking at mobilizing cultural value as it's traditionally measured in terms of statist economic criteria, say, but rather it has to do with social cohesion, it has to do with resurgence, resilience, collective expression, identity building, the social fabric as a whole. Whether or not we decide to retreat within our homes, or with this new awareness decide to enlarge community, and work in a cultural relations, what we would say a cultural relations way of working, which would be people to people, non-governmentalism, long-term agendas, not necessarily with some aim in mind, but rather as a process of going forward cohesively. So I kind of think that that idea of it as a biopolitical pandemic really does underscore the other dimension of COVID diplomacy, the way in which it makes really apparent the need for a cultural relations approach and for a movement beyond state diplomacy. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Thoughts?
Yeah. César?
Let me jump in there. Lynda, what you say is really a very nice line of thought that I would like to infuse with a couple of ideas. First, I think what you say can also be thought of from the point of view of uncertainties. I think what this pandemic shows us at this moment is that what we thought was a solid world, that the idea of the globalization as we constructed it from at least the late 1980s into the 21st century as a something solid, unchangeable, and that would last forever, brings in the idea of uncertainty. But if you were to ask me before all this, how would I think of a crisis in world affairs, I would have pointed at different things. I would have probably said to you a war between the states, a nuclear war even between the states. I would have thought of a deeper economic crisis of a different type, or what I thought would have happened before this, even a digital crisis in which the networks of banks or information technology would have a crisis. But we're talking about something different here, something that is fundamental to our biology, that hits us in a way that we didn't think of it before, and that has a potential to really affect everyone's life more or less in similar ways. So uncertainty is something, things that we declare certain now has to be reviewed. I think diplomacy is one of those aspects. We thought diplomacy was, in a certain way, something that produced outcomes, something that people executed in a certain way. Now we have to go back and rethink about solid blocks of activities that like diplomacy. Second part that I wanted to talk about is how this pandemic affects civilization, how this pandemic affects culture. And I want to say that one thing that I have learned, just to tell you something very simple, is to wash my hands thoroughly. Before that, I used to know how to wash my hands simply, but now it takes 3 minutes for me to get into the bathroom and wash my hands thoroughly, as people have learned. No, you do all the different movements, but that has also changed, at least in Mexico, the way we greet each other. As you know, Mexico is a country that has a person-to-person approach in which you shake hands, in which you embrace, in which you kiss the cheek of other people as a way to greet each other. Those things, I think, are going to change dramatically in the future. And what I'm thinking here is a little bit the idea of Norbert Elias' concept of the evolution of civilization, in which states have to regulate the behavior of people in order to make the civilization work. Now we are learning how to sneeze in public, how to assume different codes of behavior, and that certainly is going to change the culture of everyday life of people. So I'm not finishing the thought, because these are just ideas to trigger all the other discussions, but I think uncertainty and changes in people's practice that will affect culture's practice, and for sure states' practices, is something that we need to talk about more thoroughly.
Sascha, were you?
Yeah. Also jumping in here and building on Lynda's point. I mean, what's this has really shown in the past few weeks is how a local phenomenon can spread like a virus and have impact globally, disregarding any kind of national borders whatsoever. Whereas with COVID, the opposite has happened, whereas nations have retrenched themselves behind borders and build up at least psychological walls. And for me, there is actually an opportunity for cultural relations approach to diplomacy and for cultural diplomacy to really think about how one could move beyond traditional paradigms where one is projecting one's culture or nation branding and things like that, and move to deeper forms of engagement such as dialogue and collaboration. And in light of recent events, this has to happen through a profound position of humility and cultural sensitivity. Otherwise, it wouldn't be genuine nor successful. Sensitive to diverse ways of knowing, posthumanist positions that acknowledge that there's a different way of looking at the world beyond one's own epistemic position. The same about the perceived boundaries of culture. Very often they're perceived as and culture as ending where the state ends at the borders, where it's in reality is much more fluid, much more intersectional, and much more interactive, and probably often harder to define or stick into a certain box. And the same, as Lynda also said, is also applies to culture itself, which is often reduced to whether it's aesthetic pleasure or its economic impact. Is actually has much broader appeal and benefit or value, if you want to go this way. And I would reference here social cohesion, resilience, education, also self-development. So there's a great opportunity here if one was brave enough to take a different approach, a much humbler approach to how these kind of relations are actually approached.
Something you were saying, Sascha, just made me think too. Something that in NACTI that we often talk a lot about, but the methodological nationalism that pervades the field of international relations, and I think even more generally when people think about, international, they think about the interaction between nations. But in some ways, or in many ways, and I think this crisis writ large, not just COVID, but many of the things that are happening at this moment that we're speaking at, really have pointed out that cultures are not synonymous with national boundaries. That cultures can be of other communities that cross borders, and that, in a way, as we say, because COVID really has not played out, is it's people tend to say, well, a virus is a virus. And we've all heard stories like they know no political boundaries, but in fact, it does. I mean, how it does play out differently again with different populations of people, and sometimes those people are connected across political boundaries more than they're separated by them. And it seems to me that is raises an interesting moment for the state of international and intercultural relations in the world right now.
I agree. I think that part of the COVID moment too is this sense, on the one hand, of fragmentation. You know, that people are being affected in very different ways depending on all sorts of cultural and political factors. But at the same time, there is also with that an awareness of a certain possibility of cohesion that comes around that kind of, and it is related to a networked environment, it is related to the rise of information communication technology. The fact that information flows so quickly that we know about the protest here, the protests there, the response here to this, the way in which COVID is playing itself out in Brazil as opposed to Italy or Russia or Canada, and the way in which those populations are being unevenly affected. You know, and that is effective, I think, to people. They do respond to that. I think even though people are within their nations at the same time, there is that sense that this is a globalizing moment. there is this rise of a kind of global imaginary, I think, that's been there all the time, but right now it's quite acute, I would think.
Yes, but people should just jump in, by the way, but I'll moderate too if you want to wave. And César?
I would just add a little comment there by saying that following a little bit what Lynda says, this pandemic also brings in different agendas that have been made self-obvious, have popped up as something that was coexisting with the previous model that we had of cultural or international relations. For example, race, for example, gender, for example, environment. So it has provoked agendas to be more visible. And I think also it has shown people more about countries, about dramas, about, in general, relations of people inside the countries that we never imagined. Just to mention something from Mexico, to see the dilemmas of Spain, the dilemmas of Italy, the dilemmas of Great Britain on television, and to see the numbers, it really made you think and take a position on where am I in relation to all that happening there, and how is that going to affect me and my community in a way. But it also brings relations of once we got into the enclosure in the houses, it also made us oblige us to think about family relations, roles inside the families, how to take care of the little ones, and the responsibilities that one has to assume inside the family. And I'm sure we are learning a lot from the micro private lives of that we share, but also about the macro aspects of countries. And as I say, it's just agendas that were not there before are becoming more obvious, not because they not were there, but it's just that they were not visible, and this is making them visible.
Exactly. Yes. I was trying to say that, but I didn't say it as well. Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, I have questions, but sorry, I'm told I have questions coming in, but I can't see them. Yeah, this is a good time. I have a question from Mexico, actually. Eduardo Luciano Tadeo Hernandez. Are there hierarchies and inequalities in the positive networked non-state actors sorry, I'm going to start over again. Are there hierarchies and inequalities in the positive networked non-state actors diplomacy? If so, how could we overcome them?
Can I jump in?
Yeah, I was going to say, should I rephrase that? But yeah, please jump in.
Well, I'll start off, and then you two can pick up on it. I mean, the very clear inequity that exists is that network diplomacy came with the rise of information communication technologies, and huge swaths of the world's population do not have access to those. And so right away, that's a basic inequality in that system, and there are more actors that are more privileged than others. Certainly, we talk about celebrity diplomacy, and that, so it plays out in terms of social relations as well as the technologies of network diplomacy. Those are the two that hit me right away. What about you, Sascha and César?
Well, one thing that I think we need to realize is that networks have shapes, and we were accustomed to thinking in networks, at least, that were designed to produce outcomes in the interactions. But those outcomes were privileged in a way, because the networks that we established in the last few years, particularly power networks, were very much in place to continue producing the same outcomes as favoring certain groups. Now, what we find here is that the new networks, particular diplomacy networks, make people look at how these new forms of networks will shape or reshape the power landscape, and how you must actually participate in a different way as a diplomat or as a cultural actor in helping and producing, changing the traditional networks to favor other kinds of outcomes. Perhaps I couldn't really elaborate it well, but what I'm saying is this gives a possibility to producing different types of networks that hopefully will produce a change in the way traditional powers operate.
Yeah,
Thanks, Sascha.
Yeah, I would agree with that point. Maybe we need to have new networks and new coalitions. There's an opportunity here to maybe learn from what this pandemic has painfully exposed. If one only reads all those articles about WHO has failed or not failed or is limited in its setup, maybe this is not the only systemic flaw we've been looking at in the past number of months. And what I think it needs fully realizing is that the global challenges that we're looking at, and I mean, COVID has in some ways frozen certain other conversations, whether it's climate change or building an opposition to authoritarian retrenchments, is that to tackle those wicked and really heavy-hitting global problems, we need to have new coalitions that would be more effective at dealing with them. And so there's probably now a time to reinvent and rethink the way these networks are approached, and within that setup to ensure that there's a greater equality within the original setup potentially. But it might be just far too optimistic than what is possible in reality.
This raises something that was on my mind as I listened to you talk, and as we've throughout this conversation. Speaking of optimism, I mean, I can ask this, but I imagine, knowing all of you, that everybody on this panel is very sure that this is a global problem that can only be solved cooperatively and globally. But of course, one of the interesting and not very optimistic things about this crisis is that, like so many other pressing problems in the world today, there are those that think that this problem can or should only be solved nationally, that's all that matters, almost as if it's a matter of winning the war. We can do better than this society or that. That's not really a question, but it's an observation. How do those forces that believe that cooperation, that believe that science can be shared, and that believe that they really need to for social justice reasons, to make this to eliminate not only the medical problem but the biopolitical pandemic too? How does that play itself out? It's a fundamental question, as Sascha says. That it doesn't only apply, obviously, to COVID. It applies to global warming. It applies to racial and social and other social injustices. Lynda, were you?
No, I was just thinking about the question again about the notion of the inequality, and of course, all of these relations are power relations. All of these social and cultural interactions in the current environment of diplomacy, as in the past. And I think that there has to be cognizance of that, and the domination of Western modes of operating that tend to universalize its experience, and to the exclusion of other ways of knowing and being, and that has to change, in order for that conversation to open up, not in terms of finding solutions, but in terms of actually defining what the problems are. It has been up to this point, really, and continues to be a certain segment of the population of the world that actually says this is the problem, okay, everybody sign on to solve it, when in fact we need mechanisms in place that are much more interactive in terms of framing the problem itself, interactive problem framing, looking for local solutions that can be scaled up to various levels to address global issues.
I also think, going to your question, Jeffrey, that it is actually very important for the diplomatic culture to innovate their mindsets in practice, to actually change from a pure realist account of things. This is power struggle, looking just for self-interest and all that, which is to a great extent a good part of today's diplomatic calculations, and move towards a more cooperative and even more idealistic view of international relations and diplomacy. In Canada, there is an author called Daryl Copeland who talks about guerrilla diplomacy. I think that diplomats have to go out from their safe environment and jump into how to actually be more helpful for their country, for their society, but in a greater sense for the rest of humanity. Now, COVID viruses do not travel with passports. They don't ask, they don't stop in the borderline and present their documents. They simply go ahead, and this situation goes without permission. I think we need to find different solutions. Again, from diplomats must go out from their safety place and play in a different environment. They need to reshape their viewpoint of society and international relations.
Okay. I think that segues a little bit into we have a question from the floor. If people are not able to work in the same way on all three dimensions, bracket internal, as a society, and international, then how are we going to be able to limit the COVID-19 consequences? Do I have a taker there? I don't have the question on my screen, so I can't read it.
So the question was, if we aren't able to go forward in the way that we have, how will we address the COVID-19 pandemic? Oh, there we go.
Oh, you've got it on your screen. I'm sorry. I'm just learning the technology myself. It
disappeared again. So if they can't work, if people can't work on the internet, if they can't work internally, how are they going to tackle the COVID-19 pandemic? If they aren't able to work on the internet, if they aren't able to work internally, if they aren't able to.
Maybe let me express something if I understood that question.
Okay.
Is in one angle. And let me give you a little example of this. Once the COVID struck in the area of Latin America, one thing that became very obvious for many people like me, observing how countries react and what was the kind of policies they implemented, is a lack of cooperation between countries. They didn't really establish a group of experts, at least in Latin America first, to see how they could cooperate into that. And if I understand the three levels as the local, the national, and the international, I think there is a great room here to think about global governance. How are we, society, going to influence ways of reacting regionally as a group in terms of cooperating to solve common problems? And I think that's when the nation state sometimes is an obstacle, but society, because it looks for its own self-interest and not really looks into beyond, into other, cooperating with others. So I think the answer to that question might be to enhancing global governance, to really ensuring that there are policies in place to be able to react and cooperate almost immediately when we are confronted with such things like this. This is just one of those first things that will be eye-openers for what happens in the future of humanity. And I think we must be prepared to organize ourselves not as individual nations, but more in a more cooperative form.
And I guess the other thing I would say too is I'm not really sure what's meant when people say the COVID crisis. What is the crisis? Is the crisis a virus that affects people unevenly, or is the crisis the fact that it does? You know, what exactly is the crisis that we're trying to address? Is COVID just exposing all sorts of things that are actually the crisis, the real problems and the crises that are at play, and it's not in itself the crisis? I mean, that's why I wonder about the COVID crisis is so many things. You know, people say, oh, it's an economic crisis. It's a this crisis. It has so many faces.
Sascha, did you?
Well, there's
a question on the screen. How can we recreate the promise of social relations in the digital space? And maybe this, we're getting down to wrap-up time. This might be the final question. The promise of social relations in the digital space. Does this? I'll sort of jump in too, Lynda, just a second. Are we optimistic about that promise? Like Ben, the question was, how can we create? Are we optimistic that it can be, and not just address this crisis, but global crises generally? Lynda?
Oh, no, I was just going to say, you know, the social relations, and we tend to think of social relations as everything that's sort of tactile and embodied and has to do with touching and being together and things like that. And yet we have this whole world that, you know, of intimacy that goes on in 135 characters and emojis and constant contact. And it's really astounding to me the degree to which people are creative in terms of their ability to express and connect socially. That was all that came to mind right away with that. How do we recreate the promise of that? I think it's true. I mean, in that question, the promise is always there. The potential is always there. So that's all I wanted to add.
Perhaps I would like to think that question in the sense of welfare. How we societies, how the global community can produce welfare conditions in which people can actually participate and feel part of and benefit from belonging to a community. I think the global liberal aspect of society that we lived for the last decades, in which the state was reduced to something that, as an observer, in many ways not really participating actively in producing medications or producing better conditions. Now I think it's a time to rethink those relations and to bring back the state. I would say it's something essential in a way that still keeps the liberties that societies have gained, strengthens democracy, and make a refoundation of a different form of managing our social relations. I would stick to the idea of producing more welfare in a very positive sense. I'm not sure if that word translates well into, I'm more thinking in a Scandinavian way when I mention, or Canadian way when I mention welfare. But I think that's a point of departure.
Yeah. Maybe continuing on this somewhat more optimistic note is maybe it's time not to throw out the baby with the bathwater when you think about a globalized world, globalization, how this has been in retraction anyway since 2008 and so forth, and maybe salvage and think about what is actually good about, what's working about it, what may create this kind of wealth, or might create these social relations and interactions that might help us to build resilience if we once we encounter the next global challenge or global pandemic. Now is the time to build these networks, to build these new alliances, to prepare us for what's next, and not to forget what already is, which has only been frozen for these past few months now as we try to focus on solving a medical problem.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Well, I think that's a very nice place to stop and to complete our conversation. And I'd like to thank Sascha, César, Lynda, and particularly all the audience for tuning in and for the conversation. I'd also like to invite you to join us, Massey Dialogues, for future events. This Monday, June 15th at 12:30 Toronto time, Principal Natalie de Rosier will host Dr. Alicia Trotz and Dr. Lisa Robinson in a conversation about anti-Black racism. They will discuss how to create institutional change and what change looks like if we were to address anti-racism systemically. Next Tuesday afternoon, Principal de Rosier will be part of a panel alongside Richard Florida, Anita McGaughan, and Shauna Braille on cities after COVID. Details on how to register are posted on the Massey website. And on Thursday, June 18th at 5 o'clock, Massey Dialogues will host Canada's ambassador to the United States, Kirsten Hillman. She'll address the health of the Canadian-U.S. relationship and how the strong lines of communications have supported the unprecedented actions and decisions made together through this pandemic. I'm going to go a little off this prepared script. I mean, it's a pretty good example, and it's funny in the news. Canadian-American relations, the relations have seemed contentious, and we have sitting governments that seem at very different places. But the diplomatic relationship has maintained a reaction across the border that has facilitated cooperation. The ambassador will be joined in conversation by Senior Fellow Dr. Christopher Sands. So again, I'd like to thank everybody for tuning in, and I'd like to thank our panelists for the conversation.
Thank you for having us.